Twice a year, the Indian Ocean changes direction. From June through September, a powerful southwest wind sweeps across the water, pushing currents eastward, bending the paths of ships toward India and Arabia. Then, somewhere around November, the whole system reverses. The northeast monsoon takes over, driving currents back west, back toward Africa, back toward a thin strip of coastline that, for nearly 1,000 years, sat at the centre of one of the most sophisticated trading networks the ancient world ever produced. That coastline is the Swahili coast, and the story of what happened there is stranger, richer, and far more consequential than most people ever learn. Picture the shoreline as it would have looked 1,000 years ago. Mangrove forest pressing down to the water's edge. Coral reefs breaking the ocean's swells offshore. Submerged river estuaries forming natural harbours deep enough for ocean-going ships, but sheltered enough to make them safe. The geography alone was an invitation, and for centuries sailors from across the known world accepted it. But here is the question that pulls you in once you start looking closely. The city-states that rose along this coast were not empires in the conventional sense. They had no vast armies, no inland territories, no river valleys feeding millions of acres of farmland. They were, by most physical measures, small, a cluster of stone buildings on a coral island, a market town surrounded by ocean on 3 sides, a sultanate whose power depended not on conquest but on currents. And yet these places controlled the flow of gold, ivory, enslaved people, porcelain, and cloth across the entire western Indian Ocean for close to a millennium. Kilwa Kisiwani, a tiny island off the coast of what is now Tanzania, was described by the great medieval traveller Ibn Battuta as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Portuguese navigators arriving in the late 1400s found a place so wealthy and so well organised that it shook their assumptions about what they thought they would find in sub-Saharan Africa. How did this happen? That is what this video is about. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. The full story runs deeper than most histories are willing to go. It involves the physics of wind and water, the architecture of Dhows built without a single metal nail, the genetics hidden inside medieval skeletons, and a founding legend about Persian princes that turns out to be more true than anyone expected. It involves a gold road stretching hundreds of miles inland to the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, coins minted on an East African island that somehow ended up on a remote stretch of the Australian coast, and a Portuguese fleet that arrived with cannons and shattered in a few years what traders and sailors had built across centuries. It involves Islam and its role in shaping city life, law, and identity along the coast. It involves the Swahili language itself, a Bantu tongue layered with Arabic vocabulary that still carries the fingerprints of every culture that passed through these harbours. And it involves the persistent tension between legend and evidence, between the stories a people tell about where they came from and what the archaeology and the ancient DNA actually show. That tension is worth sitting with, because the Swahili coast is a place where the two have a habit of turning out to be closer than the skeptics assumed. The earliest written reference to this coastline comes from a remarkable Greek document from the 1st century, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a sailor's handbook describing the ports and trade goods of the ancient maritime world. The author calls East Africa Azania and lists its exports with the matter-of-fact precision of someone writing a commercial guide. Ivory, tortoiseshell, cinnamon, gold. The imports coming the other way were Egyptian cloth, Indian iron, Roman glass. This was not a marginal backwater. It was already plugged into a world economy, already exchanging goods with civilizations on the other side of the ocean. What happened over the following centuries, and especially from around the 10th century onward, was an amplification of something that had been building for a long time. Bantu-speaking farming communities had been settling the coast for centuries. Somali fishing camps had taken root further north. Muslim traders had begun arriving, leaving mosques that archaeologists date to the 8th and 9th centuries in some locations. The monsoon winds were already doing what they had always done. The harbours were already there. What changed was the scale, the organisation and the ambition. The winds that made this possible are worth understanding on their own terms. The southwest monsoon did not merely carry ships. It created a seasonal clock that the entire Indian Ocean economy ran on. Merchants knew when to leave, when to arrive, and when to expect the return wind home. It was not adventure, it was a schedule. And along the Swahili coast, where the monsoon was strongest and most reliable in the northern stretches near Mombasa and Kilwa. The towns that grew up were calibrated precisely to that schedule. Further south, toward Mozambique and beyond, the monsoon weakened and grew less predictable. Settlements there remained smaller and more scattered. A detail that tells you something important. The geography of the wind shaped the geography of wealth. The story ahead covers roughly 1,000 years of that wealth. The people who built it, the forces that destroyed it, and the evidence, some of it only discovered in the last few years, that is still changing how historians understand what the Swahili coast actually was. African, urban, maritime, deeply connected to Arabia, India and China, and in ways that will become clear, still very much present in the world today. Long before anyone called this place a sultanate, people were already living along the East African coast in ways that defy the old assumption of a blank slate waiting to be filled by outside forces. Go back far enough and you find the settlements that made everything else possible. Places like Unguja Uku, on the southwestern edge of Zanzibar Island, where archaeologists have uncovered the traces of a community already established by at least the 6th century. These were not temporary camps or seasonal fishing stops. The site covered several hectares and shows the hallmarks of a functioning coastal settlement: ironworking, slag, cultivated crops of pearl millet and sorghum, the bones of fish pulled from the reef, and the post holes of timber and wattle and daub structures arranged around a working waterfront. By the time Rome had long since fallen, people here were smelting iron, farming the coastal strip and hauling nets in the same waters that would later carry dhows loaded with Chinese porcelain. Tumbay on Pemba Island to the north shows a similar picture: intensive fishing, agricultural plots, a community organised enough to maintain trade relationships beyond the immediate horizon. These were Bantu-speaking communities, part of the great southward and eastward movement of farming peoples across sub-Saharan Africa that had been unfolding for centuries. They brought with them knowledge of agriculture and iron, and they adapted it to an environment that rewarded anyone who understood the sea. What makes the archaeology genuinely surprising is what those communities were already importing. In the deepest 7th century levels at Unguja Uku, researchers have found glass beads whose chemical composition traces them to Sri Lanka or South India. Not the surface layers, the oldest ones. Before any of the famous city-states existed, before any sultan had built a mosque of dressed coral, trade beads from the Indian Ocean's far side were already reaching this island on the East African coast. Later layers reveal plant-ash glass beads pointing to the Middle East, alongside Persian-style glazed ceramics and fragments of early Chinese stoneware. The picture this builds is not of a coast that was discovered by outside traders and then transformed. It is a coast that was already engaged with the wider Indian Ocean world, already offering something worth the voyage. Ivory, iron goods, and the products of a coastline exceptionally rich in marine resources would have been among the obvious draws. The offshore waters provided both subsistence and commodity. What began as fishing became, incrementally, something far more commercially ambitious. This matters for a reason that shapes everything that follows. The Swahili civilization that would eventually astonish Ibn Battuta and unnerve Portuguese captains did not arrive fully formed on Arab dhows from across the sea. It grew out of this substrate, African coastal communities with deep knowledge of local environments, with existing exchange networks running along the shore, and with harbours and islands already selected by generations of practical experience. Coral reefs that protected anchorages, river mouths that gave access to inland goods, islands like Zanzibar, Pemba, and Kilwa Kisiwani that sat just offshore, close enough to the mainland to receive its resources, far enough out to be defensible and accessible to ocean-going ships from either direction. Those islands in particular were not random choices. Coral rag, the dense limestone formed from ancient reef material, made an excellent building material when better techniques and greater wealth arrived later. The fringing reefs that seemed like obstacles to a careless navigator were, to anyone who knew the channels, a natural breakwater. Ports tucked into the lee of coral islands were calm, sheltered, and deep enough for large vessels while staying invisible to casual raiders until you were practically inside them. The communities building their livelihoods in these spots had, in effect, done the reconnaissance for the whole later urban expansion. When Muslim traders began arriving in larger numbers during the 8th and 9th centuries, they were not discovering empty shores. They were recognizing the value of something that was already there, a network of coastal nodes whose inhabitants understood the sea, maintained surplus production, and had been exchanging goods with distant partners for generations. The foundation, in other words, was African, built on farming and fishing, on ironworking and local exchange, on a coastal geography that rewarded skill and patience over brute force. What came next, the mosques and the merchant houses, the minted coins and the ocean voyages, would be layered onto something that the people already living there had spent centuries constructing from the ground up. The question is, what caused that layering to accelerate so dramatically after the 10th century? And that answer begins with the people a later tradition would call the Shirazi. Something shifted along the East African coast around the 10th century. The fishing villages and iron-working communities that had quietly maintained their connections to the wider ocean world began to transform into something considerably more ambitious. The pace of construction quickened. Stone began to replace timber. Mosques appeared on island waterfronts where only wattle and daub structures had stood before. And the harbours that had once hosted occasional foreign vessels started filling with dhows on a seasonal predictable rhythm driven by the same monsoon winds that had made the crossing possible in the first place. Out of that acceleration, the Swahili city-states were born. By the early 10th century, a string of coastal and island settlements had evolved into autonomous merchant-driven polities. Kilwa on its island south of the mainland, Mombasa tucked into its protected harbour on the Kenyan coast, Malindi a little further north, Pate on an island in the Lamu archipelago, Zanzibar anchoring the island group that carried its name. No single ruler presided over all of them, and none pretended to. They were not an empire in any conventional sense. They formed instead a loose confederation of ports, each with its own ruling lineage, its own commercial interests and its own particular position along the coast that gave it access to different hinterland trade routes. What connected them was a shared culture, a shared language taking shape from the fusion of Bantu and Arabic influences, a shared religion still in the early stages of establishing its deep roots here, and above all a shared economy built on the goods moving between the African interior and the markets of Arabia, Persia, and India. This was not uniformity. The towns competed as much as they cooperated. A merchant who found the terms at Kilwa unfavourable might load his cargo onto a dhow and sail north to Mombasa. A ruling family whose grip on local trade was threatened by a rival lineage might find that rival suddenly well supplied with foreign silver. The confederation was real, but it was held together by mutual interest rather than hierarchy, and that mutual interest fundamentally was trade. The goods that flowed through these ports explained everything about why they grew. Gold and ivory from the interior moved outward through a series of relay exchanges, passing from African trading networks near the Great Plateau regions far inland, through intermediate markets at the coast, and then into the hulls of dhows heading for Arabia and India. In return came the ceramics, glassware and textiles that Swahili elites craved as symbols of cosmopolitan wealth, and that circulated as prestige goods among the African communities further inland who supplied the raw materials. The wealth was real, and it was substantial, and wherever it concentrated, towns formed around it. Islam arrived as part of this package, and in time became inseparable from it. Muslim merchants from the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula brought their faith with them on every voyage, and over generations that faith was adopted by the coastal elites who found in it both a spiritual framework and a commercial advantage. A merchant who shared a religion, a legal tradition, and a set of ethical norms around contract and debt with his trading partners across the ocean could do business on credit, on trust, across distances that made enforcement impossible without that shared foundation. The mosque was not merely a house of worship. It was also, in a practical sense, a signal to arriving ships. Here is a community that speaks your commercial language, that operates within frameworks you recognize, that will honor agreements made in the name of God and witnessed by the community. The spread of Islam and the spread of trade were so thoroughly intertwined along this coast that separating them becomes almost meaningless. Kilwa stands as the most studied example of how a settlement became a city-state, partly because its ruins are so extensive, and partly because the historical sources, despite their contradictions, are so unusually rich. Archaeology has established that the island of Kilwa Kisiwani was occupied by at least the 9th century, with carbon-dated habitation layers placing the earliest settled communities there well before the traditions recorded in later chronicles. The great stone mosque that would eventually become one of the most impressive structures in sub-Saharan Africa began its life in the 12th century and was expanded in the 13th, a physical record of accumulating wealth laid out in dressed coral stone. Earlier structures were almost certainly timber and thatch, replaced layer by layer as prosperity justified more permanent building. But here the written record begins to complicate the archaeological one. The Kilwa Chronicle, a document compiled from oral traditions sometime around the 16th century, places the city's foundation in a specific transaction: the purchase of Kilwa Island from its original African inhabitants by a Persian merchant named Ali ibn al-Hassan, who paid a ransom of cloth encircling the entire island's perimeter as the price of the land. The story is vivid and precise in the way that founding myths always are, and it serves a clear purpose: establishing the legitimacy of a ruling lineage by anchoring it to a named founding ancestor of suitable prestige. The Arabic geographers add further layers of confusion. Al-Idrisi, writing in 1151, describes Mombasa as an already flourishing port, which places that city's substantial growth in the early 12th century at the latest. But Mombasa's own traditions and later historians have placed its founding as early as around 900 AD, and the oldest stone mosque on the island dates to around 1300, a gap that itself tells a complicated story about the pace at which building in stone followed the establishment of wealthy communities. The honest summary is that archaeology and written chronicles do not fully agree, and probably never will. Radiocarbon dating narrows the range of possibilities without eliminating debate. Ceramic typologies help establish sequences of occupation without always providing firm calendar dates. What the combined evidence suggests is that Kilwa's emergence as a serious merchant centre falls somewhere in the 9th–10th century range, that its documented political dominance came later, and that the founding story preserved in the chronicle should be read as a narrative of legitimacy rather than a precise historical record. Archaeology grounds the timeline. The chronicles explain how the people who lived there understood and presented their own past. Both are evidence. Neither is simply wrong. They are answering different questions. What archaeology does confirm, with growing clarity, is what those coral-built towns looked like at their height, and what they meant. By the 12th and 13th centuries, elite households in Kilwa and other major Swahili centres were being built from coral rag, the dense reef limestone that the coast provided in abundance, and that skilled masons could cut and shape into precisely fitted blocks. These were not modest structures. They had multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards, built-in alcoves and niches designed to display imported Chinese porcelain and Persian faience as deliberately as a modern collector might arrange a museum case. The objects were chosen to be seen. They broadcast a message about the household's connections to the wider world, its access to distant markets, its membership in a cosmopolitan trading community that stretched across the entire Indian Ocean basin. Mosques anchored the public life of these towns in a parallel way. The size and quality of a town's mosque reflected the wealth and prestige of its rulers and merchant elites just as surely as their private houses did. Building in dressed coral stone, constructing vaulted ceilings, maintaining a congregation large enough to fill the prayer hall on a Friday, all of it was simultaneously religious practice and political statement. The towns that could afford the grandest mosques were the towns that controlled the most lucrative stretches of the trade network, and everyone arriving by sea could see that immediately. What emerged across these centuries was not a single civilization stamped from a single mould, but a family of related cities sharing enough in common to be recognizable as Swahili, while remaining distinct enough to compete fiercely for the trade that sustained them all. The uncertainty in the dates does not diminish the achievement. Whether Kilwa was founded in the 9th century or the 11th, whether Mombasa's first serious buildings rose in the 10th century or slightly before, what matters is what was built, and what was built was extraordinary. The towns were there, growing, trading, praying, and displaying their wealth in coral stone and imported porcelain. And among the stories they told about how they had come to exist, one in particular reached far enough back to give the whole enterprise a legendary origin, worthy of the ambitions it had already exceeded. Among the stories the Swahili cities told about themselves, none travelled further or carried more weight than the Shirazi legend. It appeared in the Kilwa Chronicle, embedded in oral traditions up and down the coast, and surfaced again in the mouths of community elders centuries after it was first recorded. At its heart, the story is simple, almost elemental in the way that founding myths tend to be. A prince, or in some versions 7 brothers, set out from the Persian city of Shiraz sometime in the 10th or 11th century. Whether driven by ambition, by a dream, or by the kind of divine compulsion that origin stories often require, they sailed south and west until they reached the East African coast. There they found islands and harbours. There they married local women, and from those unions, the story says, the great Swahili cities were born. The towns named in various versions of the legend read like a map of the coast's most consequential places: Lamu, Pemba, the Comoro Islands, and most significantly Kilwa, the port that would eventually become the most powerful trading city on the entire stretch of coastline between the Horn of Africa and the Mozambique Channel. Each of these places could claim a founding ancestor of Persian blood. Each ruling family could trace itself, through careful genealogy, back to Shirazi, and in the world of Indian Ocean commerce, where legitimacy and prestige carried the weight that standing armies carried elsewhere, that lineage mattered enormously. To understand why, it helps to step back from the legend itself and think about the work it was doing. The Swahili coast by the 10th century was already a place defined by connection, by the meeting of African and Islamic worlds across the medium of the ocean. But connection alone does not produce authority. Authority requires a story. A ruling family that could claim descent from a prestigious Persian city was doing something very deliberate. It was anchoring itself to the broader Islamic world, positioning itself as a legitimate participant in a civilization that stretched from Persia to India to the coast of Arabia. To be Shirazi was not merely to have a particular ancestry. It was to belong, by blood and by inheritance, to the most cosmopolitan networks of the medieval world. It was to be, in the eyes of any Muslim merchant arriving from the Gulf, a recognizable kind of figure rather than an alien one. The legend made the coast legible to the ocean it traded with. There is a further political dimension that becomes visible only later, but which illuminates the legend's staying power. When Omani Arab power extended itself along the East African coast in the 17th and 19th centuries, the Shirazi identity took on a new and sharper edge. Coastal communities that had long thought of themselves as African Muslims of distinguished lineage suddenly found themselves subordinated to Arab newcomers who claimed precedence by right of recent origin. In that context, being Shirazi became a way of insisting on priority. We were here before you. Our founders came earlier, from a different direction, and what we built was ours before you arrived to claim it. The legend that had once served to connect the coast to the Islamic world now served to distinguish it from a particular kind of Islamic domination. The story was the same, but it was doing different work in a different century, and yet the archaeologists had already been noting something that complicated the legend's straightforwardness long before the geneticists arrived to complicate it further. When excavators worked through the stratigraphic layers beneath Kilwa's stone buildings, beneath Pate's coral walls and Pemba's earliest mosques, what they found consistently was not a rupture, but a continuation. The material culture of the Swahili towns, the pottery forms, the food remains, the settlement patterns showed deep and unbroken African roots. Imported goods, the Persian faience, the Chinese porcelain, the Indian beads, these were present, sometimes conspicuously so in elite contexts, but they rarely exceeded 5% of the total material assemblage at any site. The overwhelming majority of what people used, ate, built with, and discarded was locally produced and locally continuous. Whatever came from across the ocean, the towns themselves were fundamentally African places, built by African hands on African ground. This is where the legend requires its most careful reading. The Shirazi tradition does not describe a wholesale colonization. It describes intermarriage. The princes come, but they marry local women. The founding is not a displacement, but a fusion, and that detail, often overlooked in the legend's more dramatic retelling, may be its most historically telling element. What the story encodes is not the replacement of one people by another, but the grafting of a new lineage onto an existing society, a society that remained, in all the ways that matter most to daily life, essentially itself. Which brings us to the question that had lingered over the legend for generations, the question that oral traditions could not answer, and that chronicles could only gesture toward. Was any of it true? Not true in the sense of every detail confirmed, every prince named and dated, but true in the more fundamental sense. Did a real migration actually happen? Did people actually come from the direction of Persia, settle on this coast, marry into its communities, and leave descendants who became the founding families of these cities? Or was the legend a later political construction, assembled from pieces of borrowed prestige to serve the ambitions of ruling families who needed a distinguished origin story and chose Shiraz as the most convenient address. The Kilwa Chronicle itself was compiled sometime in the 16th century from older oral materials. The Arabic geographers who described the coast in the 10th and 11th centuries did not use the word Shirazi. The legend, as a recorded text, appears relatively late. That had led some historians to argue that it was essentially a medieval invention, a story built backward from a political need rather than forward from a historical event. But the answer to the question, it turns out, was not going to come from chronicles or from coral walls. It was going to come from something older and more intimate than either. It was going to come from the bones of the people themselves, from the genetic material preserved in medieval burials along this same coastline, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist when the legend was first written down to finally ask the question in a language that the dead could answer. The genetic evidence that would eventually emerge from those burials would reshape the entire conversation. It would not prove the legend in every particular. It would not confirm a prince named Ali ibn al-Hassan or 7 brothers from Shiraz. But it would reveal something more surprising and in some ways more compelling than a confirmed founding story. It would show that around the year 1000 something real and significant had happened along this coast. A demographic event. A meeting of populations. Exactly the kind of encounter that origin legends are built to remember, however imperfectly, however selectively, however much shaped by the political pressures of later centuries. The Shirazi story then sits at a rare and productive intersection. It is a legend, certainly, in the sense that it has been shaped by the needs of the people who told it. It is also, in some meaningful sense, a memory, a compressed and mythologized record of an actual historical moment when new people arrived, when marriages were made across cultural distances, and when the communities that resulted from those unions chose to mark their distinctiveness with a name and a story they could carry across the centuries. What exactly happened on that coast around the year 1000? How many people came, from exactly where, over how long a period? Those questions are precisely what the science was beginning to answer. And the answers, when they came, would be more nuanced than either the legend's believers or its skeptics had predicted. The question had been held in suspension for decades, balanced between the believers in the Shirazi legend and the skeptics who saw it as political mythology. Then, in 2023, a team of researchers published a study in Nature that did not resolve the debate so much as transform it entirely. They had done something that no historian working from chronicles, no archaeologist working from potsherds and coral blocks could have done alone. They had read the DNA of the medieval Swahili coast itself. The study analysed genetic material recovered from 80 individuals buried at medieval sites stretching across the coastline and its immediate hinterland. The burial sites included Mtwapa, Manda, Faza, Kilwa, Songomnara, and Lindi, plus an inland site at Makwasini. From these, the researchers achieved high-coverage genome sequences from 54 individuals, a remarkable technical achievement given the heat and humidity of the East African coast, conditions that degrade biological material with particular efficiency. Every genome that survived represented a kind of miracle of preservation, a voice from the ground that had waited, patient and encrypted, for centuries. What those genomes said, when the researchers finally decoded them, was striking. Every single individual in the study carried a mixture of African and Southwest Asian ancestry. Not some of them. Not the elite burials near mosque walls. All of them. The admixture was not a marginal feature of a few unusual individuals. It was the defining genetic signature of the medieval Swahili population as a whole, at least as represented in these burial contexts. The coast had not simply traded with the Persian Gulf and the Indian subcontinent. It had at some point absorbed people from those places into its biological fabric, and those people had become, through the generations, inseparable from the coastal communities they had joined. The breakdown of that Asian ancestry was itself revealing. Ancestry modelling showed that roughly 80 to 90% of the Southwest Asian component traced back not to Arabia, as many might have assumed given the coast's Islamic character, but to Persia. A smaller but meaningful portion came from the Indian subcontinent. This was not an Arab coast that happened to have African roots. It was something more specific and more historically interesting. The Persian signal was dominant, consistent and present across sites separated by hundreds of miles of coastline. But the most remarkable finding was not simply who had contributed to the Swahili gene pool. It was how the ancestry had arrived, Through which bodies? Through which lineages? In what pattern of encounter? The researchers examined the sex-biased inheritance of the different ancestries, and what they found was asymmetric in a way that told a story, almost as vivid as any chronicle. The Asian ancestry, the Persian component in particular, had arrived almost entirely through male lines. The Y chromosomes of the individual studied, the genetic material passed from father to son, carried haplogroups characteristic of Persian and broader Southwest Asian populations. Meanwhile, the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively through the maternal line, showed African ancestry in 59 of 62 cases analysed. The X chromosome analysis reinforced the pattern further. The female-biased chromosome carried a higher proportion of African ancestry than the autosomes, consistent with Asian men marrying into African communities rather than the reverse. What this means, translated out of the language of population genetics and back into the language of human lives, is something close to what the Shirazi legend had always claimed. Men came from the direction of Persia. They arrived on an African coast where African women were the mothers of the communities. Marriages happened. Children were born who carried both heritages. Those children grew up speaking what would become Swahili, building in coral and lime, praying toward Mecca in mosques that sat on African ground. The genetic signal does not describe a conquest or a colonization in any simple sense. It describes exactly the kind of intermarriage that the legend encoded in its founding narrative. The princes who came across the sea and married local women, and from those unions built something new. The researchers also attempted to date when this admixture event had occurred, using a technique based on the decay of linkage disequilibrium, essentially measuring how thoroughly the two ancestral populations' genetic material had been shuffled together over generations. The longer ago two populations mixed, the more thoroughly their DNA becomes interwoven, and that degree of intertwining can be used to estimate when the mixing began. The results placed the primary admixture event at approximately AD 1000, with confidence intervals spanning roughly AD 795 to 1085 in the northern sites, and AD 708 to 1219 in the southern ones. The ranges are wide, and they overlap enough to suggest a process that was probably not a single event, but a sustained period of contact and intermarriage that crystallized most intensively around the turn of the first millennium. That dating aligns, with some looseness, to the period when Islam was spreading along the coast, when the first stone mosques were being built, when the Swahili towns were developing the urban character that would define them for the following centuries. The connection to the Shirazi tradition is real, but it requires care. The genetics do not confirm a prince named Ali ibn al-Hassan. They do not place 7 brothers on a boat from Shiraz. What they confirm is a broader truth encoded in the legend structure, that Persian-related men arrived on this coast around the relevant period, that they integrated into African communities primarily through marriage rather than through displacement, and that their descendants became the people who built and inhabited the great coastal towns. The legend compresses and mythologizes a demographic process that was probably gradual, probably involved multiple waves of individuals rather than a single founding migration, and probably varied in its details from town to town. But the legend's essential claim, that something Persian came to something African, and that the Swahili world emerged from that encounter, turns out to be a memory of something real. There are limits to what the data can tell us, and those limits are worth holding honestly alongside the findings. The burial sites sampled were not random cross-sections of the medieval population. Burials within or adjacent to mosques and stone structures tend to reflect individuals of some social standing, and the genetics of elites may not represent the full spectrum of a society that also included farmers, fishermen, labourers, and enslaved people whose remains were never interred in archaeologically recoverable contexts. The medieval Swahili world was socially complex, and 80 individuals, however carefully analysed, are 80 windows into a world of many thousands. There is also a technical complication that the researchers themselves acknowledged openly. Many of the individuals buried on this coast would have consumed significant quantities of marine food throughout their lives, fish and shellfish and other ocean-sourced proteins. Marine carbon cycles differently from terrestrial carbon, and this creates what scientists call a marine reservoir effect in radiocarbon dating. Organic material from marine food chains can appear older than it actually is when subjected to radiocarbon measurement. This means that some of the radiocarbon dates attached to the skeletal remains, and by extension some of the dates used to calibrate the admixture timing, carry an additional layer of uncertainty. The AD 1000 figure is a robust central estimate, but the precision implied by any single date should be held lightly. The admixture event could have begun somewhat earlier, or the most intense period of mixing could have fallen somewhat later than the headline number suggests. None of this diminishes what the study achieved. It transformed a question that had seemed permanently beyond resolution into something answerable, at least in outline. The Swahili coast was not built by one people or shaped by one tradition. It was the product of an encounter between African communities with deep roots in the continental interior and maritime traditions, and Persian men who had followed the monsoon winds south and west until they found harbours worth staying in. They found communities worth joining, and the society that resulted from those meetings, from those marriages, from children raised between two worlds, became one of the most sophisticated and durable civilizations the medieval ocean ever produced. The DNA does not diminish that achievement by distributing its authorship across two continents. It deepens it by revealing how genuinely and intimately the Swahili world was made from the meeting of the ocean's edges, Africa reaching out, Persia sailing in, and something entirely new rising from the water between them. What made that meeting possible? What allowed Persian men to follow the ocean south and west until they found the harbours worth staying in, was not courage alone, or even ship design, or the political ambitions of distant rulers. It was the wind. Specifically, it was the fact that the Indian Ocean breathes. Twice a year, with a regularity that set the calendar for every civilization that ever touched its shores, the Indian Ocean reverses the direction of its prevailing winds. Between roughly June and September, a powerful southwest monsoon builds over the warming landmass of Asia and drives moisture-laden air in a great sweeping arc across the ocean, pushing ships from the East African coast toward the Indian subcontinent with the steady insistence of a hand at the back. Then, between November and February, the pattern inverts. The northeast monsoon takes over, sending winds back the other direction, carrying vessels from India and Arabia southwest toward Africa as reliably as the first wind had carried them away. The ocean does not merely permit travel in both directions, it schedules it. It issues departure windows and return windows with the dependability of a timetable, and every merchant, sailor and diplomat who ever made a living on the Indian Ocean learned to read those windows as the most important text in existence. This is what separated the Indian Ocean from most of the world's other great maritime spaces. The Mediterranean offered winds, but winds of a more chaotic and seasonal character that required different strategies. The Atlantic offered prevailing westerlies and trade winds that European sailors would eventually learn to use, but those patterns took centuries to decode and required vessels designed for deep ocean passages far from shore. The Indian Ocean's monsoon system was, by comparison, almost generous in its clarity. The winds came when you expected them, they blew in the direction you needed, and they turned around on a schedule regular enough that a careful merchant could plan a complete trading voyage. Outbound leg, time in foreign ports, homebound leg, within the span of a single year. The practical shape of that year looked something like this. A Swahili merchant loading cargo on the quayside at Kilwa or Mombasa would watch the skies around June for the signs that the southwest monsoon was strengthening. When the wind came reliably out of the southwest, ships left. Dhows loaded with gold from the interior, ivory, iron, ambergris and enslaved people cleared the harbour and let the monsoon fill their lateen sails. The crossing to ports on the Indian coast, places like Calicut on the Malabar shore, or further to Gujarat in the north, could be accomplished in a matter of weeks under favourable conditions. Time in those ports allowed for trading, for negotiating, for loading return cargo of cotton textiles, glazed ceramics, glass beads, spices, and the countless other goods the African coast hungered for. Then the merchant waited. The northeast monsoon would build in November, and when it did, the ships turned back toward Africa, arriving in time to unload before the cycle began again. What looked simple in outline was, in practice, a system of extraordinary precision and vulnerability. The monsoon was predictable in its general character, but not infinitely forgiving in its details. Arriving at an Indian port too late in the summer, monsoon season meant being stranded through the transitional weeks, waiting for the northeast winds to build. Missing the northeast monsoon departure window on the return leg could mean months of idle ships in foreign harbours, crews consuming provisions, cargo value eroding, and rivals back home consolidating advantages. a merchant who understood the wind calendar down to its finest gradations, who knew how the Somali current accelerated departure speeds off the East African coast, who recognized the early signs of the monsoon shift before less experienced sailors did, held a competitive edge worth more than almost any advantage in capital or connections. Knowledge of the winds was knowledge of wealth. This is why the Swahili port towns were organized around the monsoon, as thoroughly as any agricultural society is organized around the seasons of planting and harvest. The warehouses that lined the waterfronts of the great city-states were not incidental infrastructure. They were monuments to the logic of the wind calendar, built to hold goods during the months when ships could not move, to concentrate cargo in advance of departure windows, to protect valuable merchandise through the transitional periods when the ocean was between its two reliable directions. Kilwa's stone buildings, some of the most architecturally ambitious in sub-Saharan Africa, represented accumulated monsoon profit translated into coral and lime. Every pillar and carved doorway was built from the margins of well-timed departures and well-stocked returns. Port life itself followed the rhythm. When the northeast monsoon arrived and the first sails appeared on the horizon, the towns came alive with the business of meeting foreign ships, of negotiating prices, of inspecting goods and settling disputes, of hosting merchants who would spend weeks or months in the coastal cities before the southwest monsoon carried them home again. Those months of cohabitation were also months of diplomacy. Embassies from Arab sultans or Indian trading houses timed their visits to coincide with the wind, arriving with the monsoon that brought them and departing with the monsoon that pointed home. Political relationships, commercial agreements, marriage alliances between merchant families across the ocean, all of these were conducted within the structure of the monsoon calendar, negotiated during the windows the winds provided and sealed before the winds closed those windows again. The Swahili coast's geographic position was not incidental to this system. It was structural. The natural harbours along the coast, sheltered by coral reefs that broke the open ocean swells and created calm anchorages behind their barriers, sat directly in the path of the monsoon-driven currents. The Somali current, which flows south along the East African coast during the northeast monsoon season and reverses to flow north during the southwest monsoon, essentially provided an additional mechanical push in whichever direction a departing vessel needed. Ships leaving for India rode the southwest monsoon wind and the current that flowed in the same direction. Ships returning from India found the northeast monsoon reinforced by a current that had reversed to meet them. The coast's position at the western terminus of the Indian Ocean's great seasonal engine gave its port towns a structural advantage that no inland rival could replicate, and that no political power based elsewhere could simply commandeer. Geography and climate together created something rare in the medieval world, a natural monopoly on a critical node of long-distance exchange. The Swahili city-states did not need to conquer the sea lanes to dominate them. They simply needed to be where the winds went, to have the harbours, the warehouses, the maritime knowledge, and the diplomatic sophistication to make themselves indispensable to every party who needed to move goods between the African interior and the wider ocean world. Their power was, in a fundamental sense, meteorological before it was military or commercial. The monsoon handed them an empire and they were skilled enough to hold it. Understanding this reframes the entire story of Swahili dominance. The Persian men who sailed south and intermarried into African coastal communities were not simply following ambition. They were following the wind, which had been following this route for far longer than any human memory extended. Arab geographers, Indian pilots, and Chinese navigators all knew which way the monsoon blew. What the Swahili city-states managed over the centuries following that founding admixture around AD 1000 was to build human institutions sophisticated enough to match the precision of the wind itself, to create towns and warehouses and diplomatic networks and knowledge systems that could capture, store, and redirect the commercial energy that the monsoon delivered to their shores twice a year, every year, for 1,000 years. The ships that carried all of this commerce were as precisely adapted to the monsoon's logic as the cities that served them. And to understand what moved across that wind-driven ocean, it is worth spending time on the vessels themselves. The dhows that the Swahili sailors built from the timber and fibre of the coastal forest, and the men who knew the ocean well enough to use them. The dhow was not a single thing. It was a family of vessels, shaped over centuries by the specific demands of Indian Ocean sailing, varying in size and detail from port to port and generation to generation, but sharing a common logic that made every one of them a product of the same deep understanding of wind, water, and available materials. The Swahili variant of that tradition produced ships that were, in a precise technical sense, works of genius, built from what the coast provided and tuned to the conditions the coast imposed. The largest ocean-going dhows working the Swahili routes ran between 60 and 100 feet in length, capable of carrying 100 to 200 tons of cargo in their holds, and crewed by anywhere from 12 to 30 men depending on the vessel size and the nature of the voyage, but the numbers alone do not capture what these ships actually were. To understand a Swahili dhow, you have to start with the timber, because the timber was the foundation of everything, and the timber was unusual. Where European shipbuilders of the same period were selecting from vast forests of oak, pine and elm, Swahili boat builders worked with what the East African coast produced in abundance: coconut palm, mango, and the dense hardwoods of the coastal forest. Coconut palm provided the structural framing, its fibrous, flexible wood suited to bending under load rather than snapping, a quality that would prove significant at sea. The planking came from heavier timber, mango and other dense coastal species that could hold shape against water pressure and the constant stress of deep ocean swells. What the builders did with that timber was remarkable, not for what it included, but for what it deliberately excluded. There was no iron in these hulls, not a single nail. The planks of a Swahili dhow were sewn together, literally sewn with coir, the twisted rope made from coconut fibre, drawn through holes drilled along the plank edges in tight, overlapping loops that bound the hull into a continuous flexible structure. The technique was ancient, predating Islam and the city-states by centuries, and it produced a hull that behaved in open water in ways that nailed construction could not replicate. Where a rigid, iron-fastened hull meets a wave as a unit and transfers the full force of the impact to every joint simultaneously, a sewn hull flexes. The planks shift fractionally against each other, absorbing and distributing the shock of a swell through thousands of small movements distributed along the entire seam length. Sailors who crossed to India on these vessels were not riding rigid platforms through the swells. They were riding something closer to a woven basket, compliant and alive in the water, giving with the ocean rather than opposing it. That flexibility came with a cost. The seams that gave the hull its suppleness were also pathways for water. Mtepe vessels, among the most distinctively Swahili of the dhow types built in the Lamu archipelago, leaked copiously as a matter of course, not from damage but from design. Bailing was not an emergency measure on these ships. It was a scheduled duty, as regular and expected as working the sails. New crew members were sometimes tested on their bailing endurance before being signed on for longer voyages, because a sailor who could not maintain the bailing rhythm in heavy conditions was a liability the crew could not afford. After each monsoon season, the ships were hauled ashore for careening, a process of stripping out the old stitching, replacing the coir where it had rotted or frayed, resealing the seams with a mixture of fish oil, lime and vegetable caulk, and relaunching for the next season's work. The hull was never finished. It was perpetually under maintenance, like a living thing that required constant attention to keep functioning. Above the hull, the sail announced what kind of ship this was. The lateen rig, the great triangular sail suspended from a long yard angled acutely from a short mast, was the characteristic mark of the Indian Ocean dhow tradition and the key to its remarkable efficiency in monsoon conditions. The lateen sail could be trimmed to catch wind from a wide range of angles, allowing a skilled crew to make progress even when the wind was not perfectly behind them, which on the complex coastal approaches and in the variable conditions of the open ocean, it frequently was not. On the Swahili mtipi and related vessel types, the sail itself was often made not from woven cloth, but from palm leaf matting, strips of plaited coconut leaf sewn together into panels and reinforced at the edges, a sail that could be repaired at any port that had coconut palms, which along the entire length of the East African and Indian Ocean coast meant effectively every port. The self-sufficiency of these materials was not a limitation. It was a strategic advantage, releasing Swahili sailors from dependence on imported canvas or cordage and allowing them to maintain and repair their vessels entirely from local resources at virtually any point along their trading routes. The men who sailed these ships lived in intimate relationship with the ocean in a way that no navigation instrument fully captures. Pilots on the Indian Ocean runs used the kamal, a simple rectangular board on a knotted string that, when held at arm's length with the string taut, allowed a navigator to measure the angle of Polaris above the horizon and determine his latitude. It was precise enough for open ocean navigation across hundreds of miles of featureless water, and it required nothing more exotic than a piece of wood and a length of cord. But the Kamal was only one tool in a repertoire that was primarily carried in memory. Pilots memorized the monsoon calendar in granular detail, knowing not just when the winds shifted, but how the shift felt in the early days before it was fully established, how the quality of the swell changed in the transitional weeks, which cloud formations over the African coast announced the approaching southwest monsoon, and which clear skies over the Indian shore meant the northeast had not yet consolidated. This knowledge was not written down in any navigational manual accessible to outsiders. It lived in the minds of the pilots who had learned it from the pilots before them, passed through apprenticeship and accumulated experience until it became instinct. On the coastal approaches, different skills came into play. The colour of the water told an experienced eye about depth and bottom type. Seabird behaviour indicated proximity to land or shoals. The smell of particular coastal vegetation could be detected miles offshore. A green, resinous scent that told a crew their landfall was close before any visual confirmation was possible. The shallow draft of the smaller dhows, low enough to enter anchorages and river mouths that deeper-hulled vessels could not approach, gave Swahili traders access to ports that would later frustrate the Portuguese and other European arrivals who found their own ships trapped outside the bar while the dhows moved freely inside. Cargo handling on these vessels was its own art. Gold from the interior came packed in cloth or leather, small in volume but dense in value, stowed low in the hull for stability. Ivory required more space and more careful placement. The long tusks lashed securely to prevent shifting in a swell. Returned cargo from India, bolts of cotton textile, bags of pepper and cardamom, ceramic vessels nested in straw packing, required different stowage strategies, bulk managed against the hull's capacity and the need to keep the ship in trim. A poorly loaded dhow handled sluggishly at best and dangerously at worst, and the experienced sailors who knew how to distribute weight across a loaded hull were as valuable to a merchant as the cargo itself. The risks were real and were understood without sentimentality. The Swahili coast coral reefs, the same reefs that sheltered harbours and provided building material for the great stone towns, were navigational hazards of the first order for any vessel approaching from seaward in poor visibility or unfamiliar conditions. Storms in the transitional weeks between monsoon seasons could catch ships in the open ocean with little warning, and a dhow whose stitching had weakened over the course of a long voyage, whose hull was working more than usual in heavy weather, required judgment calls about whether to push on or put into an unplanned port for repairs, decisions where a wrong answer cost not just the cargo but the ship and everyone aboard. What the Swahili sailors built, through generations of accumulated skill and refined technique, was a system in which environmental knowledge, material ingenuity and human expertise were so thoroughly integrated that the line between seamanship and commerce blurred entirely. The dhow was not merely transport. It was the mechanism by which monsoon became money, by which a predictable wind became a durable economic empire spanning half the known world. Among all the ports and stone towns strung along the 1,000 miles of the Swahili coast, one city pulled decisively ahead. By the 13th century, if you were an Arab geographer compiling a survey of the Indian Ocean world, or a merchant captain plotting the most profitable circuit through East African waters, there was one name that carried more weight than any other. Kilwa Kisiwani, Kilwa of the island, a city built on a small coral island just off the southern Tanzanian coast, separated from the mainland by a channel narrow enough to cross in a short canoe ride, but wide enough to make the city a natural fortress, a place where trade could be monitored, taxed and controlled with a precision that mainland ports could never quite achieve. The island itself was not obviously exceptional. What made Kilwa exceptional was the series of decisions, relationships and strategic advantages that its rulers accumulated over the course of 3 centuries, layering power upon power, until the Sultanate stood at the centre of a commercial network that stretched from the Zambezi mouth in the south to the ports of the Kenya coast in the north, and outward across the Indian Ocean to Arabia, Persia, India and eventually China. Understanding how that happened requires following 2 threads simultaneously: the thread of geography and commerce, and the thread of stone and mortar, because in Kilwa those 2 threads were woven into a single story. The geographic logic was compelling from the start. Kilwa sat at almost exactly the point where the monsoon system's southern limits created a natural staging post. Ships arriving from the north with the northeast monsoon could ride the current and wind down to Kilwa, and still have enough season left to conduct their business. Ships attempting to push further south into less predictable waters faced diminishing returns. Kilwa was, in a navigational sense, the last comfortable port on the main circuit, which meant it was also the natural collection point for everything moving in either direction. The Sultanate's rulers recognised that geography and built their entire political economy around it. The decisive move came with Sofala. The port of Sofala, further south down the Mozambique coast, was the coastal outlet for gold coming overland from the interior plateau, from the civilization centred on Great Zimbabwe, where stone enclosures and accumulating wealth marked a polity producing gold in quantities that the Indian Ocean markets could absorb almost without limit. Kilwa's seizure of control over Sofala transformed the Sultanate from a prosperous trading city into something qualitatively different, the gatekeeper of the gold road. All the gold and ivory flowing from the interior to the coast, and from the coast to Arabia and India, now passed through Kilwa's commercial infrastructure and filled Kilwa's treasury. The monopoly was not absolute, and rivals occasionally found ways around it. But for the better part of 2 centuries, Kilwa's hold on the Sofala trade was tight enough to fund an urban project without parallel on the East African coast. That project expressed itself in stone. The Great Mosque of Kilwa, its earliest coral stone construction dating to roughly the mid-12th century, grew through successive expansions into the largest mosque built in the Swahili tradition, its vaulted roof supported by columns of coral and its floor plan extending through multiple prayer halls added as the city's wealth and population demanded more space. Walking through its remains today, the scale still registers as remarkable, not because it competes with the great mosques of Cairo or Isfahan, but because it materialized from a coral island off the East African coast, built by communities whose ancestors a few generations earlier had been conducting their religious observances in timber and thatch. The stone was an announcement, made in architectural terms, that Kilwa had arrived as a city of permanent consequence. The palace of Husuni Kubwa, raised in the 14th century under Sultan al-Hassan ibn Sulayman, made the same announcement at an even grander scale. The complex spread across a promontory overlooking the ocean, its coral stone walls enclosing a structure with over 100 rooms, an octagonal bathing pool of a design with parallels in Persian palatial architecture, warehousing capacity for the bulk goods that flowed through the city's commercial quarter, and a causeway system extending to the water's edge that served as both a harbour approach and a means of controlling movement in and out of the complex. It was a building that functioned simultaneously as palace, warehouse, customs house, and political theatre, a physical statement about who controlled the trade and who benefited from it. Nothing remotely comparable existed at any other Swahili site in the same period. The Chinese porcelain tells the same story in a different register. Archaeological excavation at Kilwa has recovered Chinese celadon ceramics in quantities that dwarf comparable finds at any other Swahili city-state, 13th and 14th century pieces predominantly, glazed in the soft blue-green that Chinese kilns had perfected for export markets, arriving at Kilwa as high-value trade goods and ending up embedded in wall niches and displayed on shelves as markers of cosmopolitan taste and purchasing power. Arabian glass arrived alongside the ceramics. The imported objects were not merely decorative, they were statements about reach, about the breadth of the network Kilwa had plugged into, about a city whose commercial tentacles extended to the workshops of the Yangtze Delta and the glass furnaces of the Persian Gulf. The Sultanate reinforced its position through a combination of diplomacy and demographic projection. At its peak, Kilwa claimed authority over ports from the Kenya-Tanzania border region down to the Zambezi mouth. Malindi, Mombasa, Pemba, Zanzibar, Mafia Island, the Comoros and Sofala. A political geography documented by Arabic geographers and sustained through diplomatic marriages, tribute arrangements, and the placement of governors loyal to the Kilwa court at key nodes along the coast. This was not an empire in the continental sense, not a territory held by garrisons and administered through a bureaucracy. It was a network of relationships, commercial and political, reinforced by family ties and shared interests, and the credible threat that Kilwa could redirect trade flows and cut off access to the profitable Indian Ocean circuits for any port that broke the arrangement. And Kilwa minted its own money. Copper coins, silver coins, and gold coins circulated from roughly 1100 CE onward. a monetary system that gave the sultanates' commercial transactions a formalized medium and announced, to any merchant who handled the coins, that they were dealing with a sovereign polity capable of guaranteeing its own currency. The coinage was another piece of the same argument the mosques and palaces were making, that Kilwa was a real place, a permanent institution, a state with the capacity to impose order on the commerce flowing through it. But the chronicles that celebrate this story deserve a careful reading. The Kilwa Chronicle, the narrative text that preserves the Sultanate's founding legends and its dynastic history, was composed from oral traditions and written down in forms that show clear signs of political editing. The Persian Shirazi origin story it centres places the city's foundation in a moment of noble immigration from the Gulf, and while DNA evidence does confirm that Persian male ancestry entered the Swahili population around 1000 CE, the chronicle's specific genealogies and founding dates do not line up cleanly with what radiocarbon dating of the earlier stone structures reveals. Some of those structures predate the chronicle's preferred founding moment by a century or more. The text was not simply a record, it was also an argument, made by later rulers who needed legitimizing ancestry and religious prestige, and those needs shaped what the chronicle chose to remember and what it preferred to obscure. Archaeology does not tell a simpler story, but it tells a more honest one. The mosques and the porcelain and the palace and the coins, these survive outside the reach of political editing, and what they confirm is a city that genuinely earned its prominence through a combination of geographic luck, commercial acumen, architectural investment and sustained political energy. The legends dressed the story in noble lineage. The stones recorded what actually happened. To understand what made Kilwa's monopoly so durable, you have to follow the gold backward from the harbour, away from the ocean, away from the dhow masts and the merchant houses and the coral stone walls, and trace it to its origin several hundred miles inland, where the plateau of southern Africa folded into river valleys and gold-bearing seams that had been worked for generations before anyone in Arabia or India had ever heard the name Kilwa. The source was not a single mine or a single polity. It was a diffuse network of extraction and accumulation centred on what we call Great Zimbabwe, the stone enclosure complex that gave its name to a modern nation, and that, at its peak between the 12th and 15th centuries, served as the political and ceremonial heart of a civilization producing gold in volumes the Indian Ocean markets never quite stopped demanding. The people of Great Zimbabwe and the surrounding plateau were not primitive diggers stumbling across surface deposits. They were organised, systematic extractors who worked deep into the earth and who understood that gold was not simply beautiful but exchangeable, a commodity that could be converted into imported cloth, glass beads, and glazed ceramics arriving from coastal intermediaries. The relationship between the interior and the coast was not a relationship between a sophisticated world and an isolated one. It was a relationship between two sophisticated worlds that needed each other. What the interior needed was access to the goods that only the ocean trade could deliver. What the coast needed was the gold and ivory that only the interior could supply. The question was always geographic. How did the exchange actually happen across a distance of several hundred miles of river valley and thornbush and seasonal floodplain? The answer was Sofala. The port sat on the Buzi River estuary, a low-lying, fever-prone piece of coastline that would not have struck an arriving sailor as obviously promising. It was not a natural harbour of great shelter or depth. The climate was brutal, the tidal approaches tricky, and the surrounding land offered little in the way of local resources beyond proximity to the river systems that made it matter. But that proximity was everything. The Buzi River and the Save River flowing through the interior provided navigable channels that smaller rivercraft could work upstream, carrying goods into the interior and returning loaded with gold and elephant ivory. From Sofala, a traveller moving inland along the Buzi could reach the market town of Manica within a feasible overland distance, and Manica sat at the junction of the coastal trade network and the highland gold-producing regions. The geography had created a funnel, and Sofala was its mouth. For much of the early medieval period, that funnel was controlled by merchants operating out of Mogadishu, the great port city far to the north along the East African coast. They had established relationships with interior brokers, maintained warehouses at Sofala, and collected the gold flowing down from the plateau before moving it north along the coast and out across the Indian Ocean. It was a profitable arrangement, and it gave Mogadishu reach and influence that stretched far south of its own geographic position. But the arrangement also required a distant patron to maintain control over a port it could not easily police or reinforce, which created a vulnerability that an ambitious ruler farther south could eventually exploit. Around the 1180s, Sultan Suleiman Hassan of Kilwa recognized that vulnerability and acted on it. His seizure of Sofala from the Mogadishu-linked merchants was the single most consequential act in Kilwa's history, more consequential in a commercial sense than any stone mosque or palatial complex the city would later build. The architectural monuments were expressions of wealth. The capture of Sofala was the mechanism that generated it. With Sofala under Kilwan authority, every gram of gold leaving the interior plateau for the Indian Ocean markets now passed through a system that Kilwa controlled, taxed and organised. The windfall of revenue that poured into the Sultanate's treasury from that point forward funded everything else. The palace expansions, the mosque enlargements, the fleet of dhows, the diplomatic missions, and the coinage system that formalised the city's commercial authority. But the gold did not move by itself, and Kilwa did not extract it directly. What the Sultanate controlled was the top of a chain that depended on dozens of intermediaries operating across hundreds of miles. At the deepest level of that chain were the interior miners and chiefs of the Zimbabwe plateau, who organised extraction and held authority over the ground. They dealt with a layer of inland traders who aggregated small quantities of gold and ivory into tradable volumes and moved them toward the coast. Those inland traders dealt in turn with the brokers stationed along the river routes. In Swahili commercial terminology, the Vashambadzi, the negotiating merchants who built the relationships between highland chiefs and coastal buyers, learned the languages and political protocols of the interior, and served as the indispensable translators between two economic worlds that could not easily speak directly to each other. The Vashambadzi's role was not simply logistical. They were political operators whose personal relationships with inland chiefs gave them access that no outsider could replicate quickly or cheaply. They extended credit, received tribute, managed disputes, and cultivated the trust that kept gold moving toward the coast in preference to being hoarded or diverted. Some of them may have been Swahili-born men who had moved into the interior and partially adopted local customs. Others may have been interior men who had learned enough of the coastal commercial world to operate as brokers in both directions. The boundary was permeable, and the men who worked it were among the most economically essential figures in the entire system, even though the chronicles and geographers tend to centre their attention on the sultans and the ships, rather than on the brokers moving through the bush. From the river routes, the gold and ivory reached Sofala, where it was loaded onto the ocean-going dhows that Kilwa stationed at the port. The dhows carried it north along the coast to Kilwa itself, where it entered the city's trading infrastructure, weighed, taxed and exchanged for the Asian goods that the inland brokers would eventually carry back up the river routes as payment for the next consignment. Glass beads from India, cotton cloth from Gujarat, glazed porcelain from China, all of it moved in the opposite direction along the same chain, and the appetite for those goods among the interior elites was what kept the gold moving out. The circuit was self-reinforcing. Demand at each end sustained supply at the other. What this meant at the political level was that control of a single port could reorganize the balance of power across the entire coast. Sofala was geographically irreplaceable. There was no alternative port that offered the same river corridor access to the gold-producing interior. Any coastal city that held Sofala held a choke point through which a commodity that the entire Indian Ocean world valued had to pass. Kilwa's rivals, Mogadishu to the north, the growing ports of the Kenya coast, the island towns of the Comoros, could develop their own trade circuits and their own commercial relationships, but none of them could replicate the Zimbabwe gold connection. That connection was Sofala's alone, and Sofala now belonged to Kilwa. The consequences ran in both directions. Kilwa's hold on Sofala made it the dominant node in the coastal network, and gave its sultans leverage over rival cities that had nothing comparable to offer. And when, centuries later, Portuguese aggression and internal instability would begin to loosen Kilwa's grip on Sofala, the Sultanate's power would drain away with surprising speed, as though the city had always been, beneath all its stone and ceremony, a structure built on a single strategic advantage. And the moment that advantage was compromised, the architecture of dominance it had supported began to crumble. But that dissolution was still centuries away. In the high medieval period, the gold road ran clear from the plateau to the port. The dhows loaded and departed on the northeast monsoon, and Kilwa's treasury filled with revenues from a trade network that stretched from the interior of southern Africa to the markets of the Arabian Peninsula, the ports of western India, and the warehouses of Song Dynasty China. So what happened to all that gold once it left Kilwa's harbour? The dhow took the northeast monsoon north and east across open water, and the cargo it carried entered a commercial world of staggering geographic breadth, a world whose connections touched Arabia, Persia, the subcontinent of India, and the workshops of China. Kilwa was not a destination in that world. It was a junction, and understanding what that junction actually moved in both directions reveals the true scale of what the Swahili coast had built over the course of several centuries. The corridor ran from Mogadishu in the north to Kilwa in the south, and from that African spine it branched outward across the Indian Ocean in multiple directions simultaneously. To the northeast, the lanes led to Aden and the southern tip of Arabia, where the Red Sea trades converged with the Persian Gulf routes, and where merchants from a dozen different polities exchanged goods, information, and credit in markets that never entirely closed. Beyond Aden, the routes extended into the Persian Gulf itself, to Siraf, to Hormuz, to Basra, pulling in the glassware, metalwork, and finished goods of the Iranian world. Eastward from those same Arabian ports, the lanes reached the western coast of India, particularly the Gujarat ports of Cambay and later Surat, and then continued further still, through the straits of the Malay Peninsula and across the South China Sea to the port cities of the Ming Empire. A bolt of Chinese silk that ended up draped across the shoulders of a Kilwa merchant had crossed several thousand miles of open ocean through at least 2 or 3 sets of hands before arriving on the East African coast. The Indian Ocean was not a barrier. It was a highway, and the Swahili ports were among its most important staging posts. What the African coast sent out was a precise set of commodities that the rest of that world found difficult or impossible to source elsewhere. Gold from Great Zimbabwe was the headline export, the commodity whose scarcity everywhere else gave the Swahili network its leverage. Ivory was a close second. East African elephant tusks were larger and denser than their Indian counterparts, qualities that craftsmen in China and India specifically preferred for carving. Alongside gold and ivory moved mangrove timber, that hard, straight-grained polewood that grew in the coastal forests and served as an indispensable construction material in the treeless Arabian Peninsula, where it was used for roof beams in the houses of Muscat and Oman. Copper came down from interior deposits, animal hides moved in baled quantities, and alongside all of these, in numbers that complicate any comfortable narrative of peaceful exchange, human beings were traded. Enslaved men, women and children whose labour fed the agricultural estates of Arabia, the armies of Persian rulers, and the households of wealthy merchants across the Gulf. The trade was not only in beautiful things. What came back was equally varied and far more visible in the archaeological record. Chinese porcelain arrived in quantities that would strike a modern observer as extraordinary. The bowls and dishes of the Song, Yuan and Ming dynasties were not merely stored on shelves in Kilwa's merchant houses. They were embedded into the plaster of palace walls and pressed into the vaulted ceilings of elite residences, serving as a permanent architectural declaration of cosmopolitan status and commercial reach. When Ibn Battuta arrived at Kilwa around 1331 and described a city of exceptional beauty and refinement, he was looking at a place literally decorated with the evidence of its own trade connections. The Chinese porcelain was not incidental ornamentation. It was a message written in fired clay and celadon glaze, announcing to every visitor exactly how far this city's networks extended. Indian cotton textiles arrived in enormous volumes. Calicos and chintzes from Gujarat, plain weaves and patterned cloths that served both the Swahili elite and the inland brokers, who carried them up the river routes as trade goods and tribute payments to interior chiefs. A bolt of Indian cotton could travel from a Gujarat loom to a Kilwa warehouse to a Zimbabwe plateau chief's compound over the course of a year or two, passing through hands that never shared a common language but understood perfectly the value being exchanged. Persian glassware and metalwork filled the import manifests alongside Arab spices and glass beads, particularly those blue and green Indian glass beads that archaeologists recover by the thousands from Swahili sites, and that served as a form of currency and prestige commodity throughout the interior trade networks. Perfumes, incense, and fine textiles rounded out the picture, feeding an elite taste that had grown accustomed to luxury on a genuinely global scale. What matters here is not simply the list of goods, but the structural role the Swahili towns played in moving them. The cities of the coast were not producers. They were brokers, sophisticated intermediaries who sat at the meeting point of two commercial worlds that could not easily access each other directly. The interior of Africa had gold and ivory and no ocean access. The merchants of Arabia and India had ships and manufactured goods and no gold road. The Swahili towns were the indispensable connection between those two worlds, collecting the interior's wealth, packaging it for ocean transit, and distributing the returning luxuries back along the inland networks. Scholars who have analysed this system describe it as relay trade, a sequential chain of exchanges in which no single actor needed to control the entire route, but in which the most advantageously positioned actor could extract value from every transaction passing through. That positioning generated prosperity visible in everything from urban architecture to personal dress. The Sultan's court that Ibn Battuta described displayed imported silks and fine garments as markers of authority. The elite households of Kilwa and Mombasa and Lamu furnished themselves with imported glassware and Chinese ceramics in ways that tracked precisely the currents of the ocean trade. When particular Chinese dynasties shifted their export production, the ceramics arriving on the coast changed, and those changes show up in the stratigraphy of excavated Swahili sites like chapters in a commercial history. Persian glassware appears in layers dated to the 11th and 12th centuries. Yuan period blue and white porcelain marks the 14th. Ming wares crowd the 15th. The archaeology is, among other things, a record of the Indian Ocean's changing commercial geography as seen from one of its most consistent participants. The city's own coinage, minted in copper and later in silver and gold from the 11th century onward, formalized this commercial sophistication. A market that generates enough surplus to mint its own money is not a peripheral market. It is a center, one with the institutional infrastructure to regulate exchange, store value, and extend credit across distances. Kilwa's coins circulated along the coast, and, as later discoveries would suggest, possibly far beyond. Their presence in distant places a testament to how deeply the city had embedded itself in the transactional fabric of the wider ocean world. And what this volume of exchange did to urban culture on the coast was transformative in ways that went beyond the decorative. Prosperity from trade-funded mosques, palace complexes, and coral stone townhouses. It supported scholars, scribes, and jurists who had been educated in Mecca, Shirazi, and the great centres of Islamic learning. It created an urban population diverse enough to include permanent communities of Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian residents, living alongside the Swahili majority, each contributing to a cultural synthesis that produced its own literature, its own legal traditions, and its own aesthetic sensibility. The taste for Chinese porcelain was not simply acquisitive. It was the expression of a society that understood itself as part of a global network, and chose to make that understanding legible in stone and plaster, and the fragments of glazed ceramics pressed into the walls of its most important buildings. The Swahili towns were not looking outward from the margins of the world they inhabited. They were operating at its centre, collecting, sorting, dispatching, receiving, the patient and indispensable brokers of an ocean system that, for several centuries, moved more wealth than any other trade network on Earth. All of that commerce needed a foundation that went deeper than the seasonal winds or the price of gold at any given moment. Trust was the essential infrastructure of long-distance trade, and on the Swahili coast, trust had a name and a legal framework. It was called Islam, and by the 12th century it had become the organizing principle of commercial, political and domestic life in every significant port town from Mogadishu to Kilwa. The faith had not arrived all at once. Arab and Persian traders began introducing Islamic practice to the East African coast as early as the 8th and 9th centuries, in the quiet, gradual way that merchant religions often spread. Through marriage, through the shared rituals of the counting house, through the slow accumulation of communities large enough to justify a permanent mosque. By the 10th and 11th centuries, mosque foundations appear in the archaeological record with increasing regularity. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Islam was not simply present on the coast, it was dominant, structuring everything from inheritance disputes to the architecture of power. What made Islam so commercially valuable, beyond its spiritual content, was the Shafi'i school of Sunni law, the particular legal tradition that took root along the coast and became its normative framework. The Shafi'i school provided a shared contract language for merchants who had never met, who lived thousands of miles apart, and who needed to extend credit and honour obligations across that distance with no enforcement mechanism beyond reputation and law. A Gujarati merchant arriving in Kilwa and a Kilwa merchant arriving in Oman both operated within recognisable Shafi'i legal structures. They knew how a valid contract was formed, how disputes would be adjudicated, what a qadi, an Islamic judge, would require as evidence. That shared framework was worth more than any individual commodity passing through the port. It was the lubricant of the entire system. The qadis appointed by Swahili sultans were not peripheral figures. They sat at the intersection of political authority and commercial life, resolving the disputes that inevitably arose when men of different origins, different languages, and high financial stakes found themselves in disagreement. A merchant who trusted the Kilwa qadi's judgment would extend credit to Kilwa's merchants that he would withhold from partners operating in legal systems he could not predict. Conversion to Islam, or at minimum credible participation in its social forms, was therefore not merely a spiritual choice. It was a commercial credential, a signal of reliability and trustworthiness that opened doors otherwise closed to outsiders. This dynamic shaped the social hierarchy of the port towns in ways that were visible and sometimes stark. Elite Swahili families publicly maintained claims to Arab or Persian ancestry, not out of simple vanity but because such lineage conveyed a layered prestige, access to mosque patronage, to political authority, to the high-value trade contracts that circulated among the most established merchant networks. A man who could credibly trace his lineage to Shirazi or to an Arabian trading family occupied a different social position than one who could not, regardless of what the genetic record, now partially recovered by modern science, might actually reveal about the true complexity of those ancestral claims. Prestige and genealogy on the Swahili coast were partly performance, partly genuine inheritance, and entirely consequential. Below this elite tier moved a more fluid world of mixed heritage merchants, skilled artisans, and agricultural workers whose daily lives gave the port towns their actual texture. The towns themselves were organised into neighbourhoods called mita, each centred on its own mosque, which served as a gathering point, a school, and a social anchor for the surrounding district. The main mosque of a major town like Kilwa was a more imposing structure, built in coral stone with columns and vaulted ceilings, capable of accommodating the substantial population of merchants and townspeople who gathered for Friday prayers. Markets clustered around these mosque districts naturally, because the congregation and the commercial exchange shared the same geography and the same pulse. The rhythm of the day organised by prayer times, the week organised around Friday, the year organised around the Islamic calendar's fasts and festivals. The physical fabric of these towns was itself a record of the culture that had produced it. Swahili architecture combined African spatial logic with Islamic aesthetic conventions and the practical constraints of a coastal environment where coral stone was the dominant available building material. Wealthy households rose in walls of coralline limestone plastered smooth with lime, their interiors organised around private central courtyards that provided shade, ventilation, and the crucial separation of domestic privacy from public commerce. The courtyard was not simply a design feature, it was an expression of Islamic ideas about the proper organisation of household space, the protection of family life from the gaze of the street, the distinction between the world of men's business and the world of women's authority within the home. The doors of these houses deserve particular attention, because they were among the most eloquent objects the Swahili towns produced. Elaborately carved from hardwood, set in carved stone frames, sometimes bearing Arabic inscriptions from the Quran, they announced the status of the household to every person who passed in the street. The quality of the carving, the depth of the geometric and floral patterns, the presence of calligraphic text, all of these communicated precisely how far the family inside had travelled in wealth and learning and cosmopolitan connection. A fine door in 12th century Kilwa was, in its way, as legible a status declaration as the Chinese porcelain pressed into the plaster of the palace walls. And then there was the language. Swahili, Kiswahili, is at its core a Bantu language, built on the grammatical foundations of the Sabaki language group that spread along the East African coast, long before the first Arab dhow dropped anchor in a coral lagoon. But the centuries of contact with Arabic-speaking merchants, Islamic scholars, and the Quran schools that spread along the coast transformed its vocabulary in ways that are still audible today. Arabic loanwords constitute somewhere between a fifth and perhaps 2/5 of the language's total vocabulary, depending on how one counts and which registers one examines. The proportion is high enough that a speaker of Omani Arabic arriving in a Kilwa market would have found significant purchase in the language being spoken around him. That Arabic vocabulary carried specific weight. The words for law, for God, for commerce, for writing, for the most prestigious forms of knowledge, many of these came from Arabic, which meant they carried the authority of the Quran and of Islamic scholarship. Swahili was first written in the Arabic script, the Ajami script, used in Quran schools where children learned to read the holy text, and in the commercial correspondence that passed between merchants, letters, contracts, accounts. The Arabic alphabet was not simply a writing system. It was a signal of Islamic literacy, a marker of participation in the wider world of Indian Ocean scholarship and law. This blending, African grammatical structure carrying Arabic and Persian and later Indian vocabulary, organized by Islamic legal frameworks, expressed in architecture that owed something to every culture that had passed through the harbour, produced something that was neither purely African nor purely Arab nor Persian nor Indian, but distinctly and irreducibly Swahili. It was a cosmopolitan identity built by centuries of encounter, and its carriers wore it with confidence. The Swahili merchants and scholars and sultans of the medieval coast did not experience themselves as peripheral figures absorbing outside influences. They experienced themselves as full participants in a sophisticated and successful civilization that they had built on their own particular piece of the Indian Ocean world. Women moved through this world in ways that Islamic law simultaneously constrained and protected. They administered household economies of considerable complexity, managed the inheritance of property under Shafi'i rules, participated in textile production and market vending, and through their marriages and lineages anchored the social alliances that connected merchant families across generations. The courtyard house was their domain in a meaningful sense, and within it they exercised real authority over the rhythms of daily life. Public baths, Sufi brotherhoods, and madrasas filled out the social landscape of the larger towns, providing communal spaces for religious practice, mystical devotion, and the transmission of Islamic learning that gave the coast its intellectual coherence. A scholar trained in one Swahili town could find familiar institutions in any other. A merchant who had earned trust in Kilwa carried that trust, legible and recognized, all the way to the Gulf. Faith, language, and the shaped stone of the port towns had together made something durable, a civilization fluent in the widest possible sense of the word. That civilization expressed its confidence in many ways, through the carved doors of its coral stone houses, through the authority of its qadis, through the Arabic inscriptions pressed into lime plaster above the gates of its mosques. But perhaps no expression of Swahili sovereignty was more precise, more deliberate, and more loaded with political meaning than the decision to mint coins. Kilwa began striking its own coinage sometime in the early 11th century, and the act carried implications that went far beyond the practical convenience of a standardized medium of exchange. Every state that mints a coin is making a claim. It is saying that its authority is real, that its word can be trusted across distance, that the metal it stamps and issues will be honoured by strangers who have never met the ruler whose name or symbol the coin bears. In the medieval Indian Ocean world, where the language of sovereignty was understood by merchants from Oman to Gujarat to Canton, the production of coinage was a declaration legible to anyone who held commerce close enough to care about it. Kilwa was not simply a prosperous town. It was a polity confident enough to issue its own money. The coins themselves followed a recognizable hierarchy of metals. Copper pieces formed the workhorse denomination, small uniform discs running roughly 20 to 25 millimeters across and weighing between 1.5 and 2.5 grams, produced in large enough quantities to serve the daily transactions of the market. Silver issues followed, more prestigious and more limited in circulation. Gold coins represented the rarest tier of the mint's output, produced in restricted numbers, likely intended for high-value commercial settlements and for the kind of ceremonial exchange that demonstrated a ruler's wealth and reached to visiting dignitaries. The full range of metals, copper, silver, gold, mirrored the full range of trade that Kilwa controlled, from the small daily commerce of the harbour market to the enormous flows of bullion moving up from the Sofala Gold Road. The mint was, in miniature, a portrait of the sultanate's economy. What the coins also provided was commercial trust at scale. A Gujarati merchant extending credit to a Kilwa trading house needed more than the goodwill of an individual partner. He needed a system, a recognized unit of value, a stable standard against which debts could be denominated and settlements reached with confidence. Kilwa's coinage served that function within the regional network for roughly 5 centuries, from approximately 1100 to 1600. That is a long enough run to matter, long enough for the coins to become genuinely embedded in the commercial expectations of everyone who traded regularly on the East African coast. And the distribution of surviving coins reflects this regional role with interesting precision. They cluster in Kilwa itself and in the nearby Mafia Islands. Scattered examples turn up at Great Zimbabwe, deep in the interior, confirming the Gold Road's connection to the coast. A few appear in Oman, but the coins do not circulate widely across the whole Indian Ocean basin in the way that Chinese copper cash or Venetian ducats eventually would. They were a regional standard, a mark of Kilwa's authority within its own sphere, which was, it should be said, a sphere of considerable size and commercial weight. Then, in 1944, something happened that changed the conversation around these coins entirely. A soldier stationed on the Wessel Islands, a remote archipelago off the Northern Territory of Australia, picked up a small collection of coins from a beach. He kept them, more or less forgot about them, and it was not until years later that they were examined by anyone with the knowledge to understand what they were. 5 of the coins turned out to be Kilwa pieces. The remaining 4 were identified as Dutch East India Company coins. The Kilwa specimens dated to the 1100s, the same centuries in which the Sultanate was growing toward the height of its power, minting copper and building the coral stone warehouses and mosques that would eventually attract the attention of Ibn Battuta. 9 coins, 5 from a sultanate on the East African coast, lying on a beach in Australia's far north. The discovery landed quietly at first, but has never really left the conversation since. Its implications, if any can be drawn at all, are potentially enormous, and that conditionality matters because the coins do not come with an explanation attached. Scholars have proposed several frameworks for understanding how 11th century Kilwa copper might end up on an Australian shore. The first involves a Swahili or Asian dhow, possibly carrying Kilwa coins as trade currency or personal property, that was wrecked somewhere in the region during the centuries before European contact. The Macassan fishermen of what is now Indonesia are known to have made regular voyages to northern Australia's coast in search of trepang, the sea cucumber prized in Chinese markets, and it is not impossible that coins moving through Asian trade networks reach those shores through connections we have not yet mapped. A second hypothesis places the coins on a Portuguese vessel. After the Portuguese sacked Kilwa in 1505, they appropriated significant quantities of the city's wealth, including almost certainly coins, and the scattered wreck of a Portuguese ship in unfamiliar southern waters could in theory account for the deposit. A third possibility involves even later European movement of the coins, carried as curiosities or trade items in ways that have left no documentary trace. What no reputable scholar claims is a direct Swahili voyage to Australia. The evidence simply does not support it. No other material traces of Swahili presence have been found in Australia. No oral traditions suggest contact, and the oceanographic logic of a deliberate dhow voyage from Kilwa to the Wessel Islands faces formidable challenges that the monsoon system, for all its remarkable utility, does not easily resolve. The coins are a fact. The voyage that carried them is a hypothesis, and a contested one. But that uncertainty is precisely what makes the Wessel Islands discovery so compelling as a historical artifact and not merely as a curiosity. The coins sit at the edge of what we know and refuse to retreat back inside its borders. They remind us that Indian Ocean networks in the medieval period were far more intricate and far-reaching than the surviving documentary record allows us to see clearly. Trade goods moved through multiple hands across enormous distances, carried by intermediaries whose names no chronicle recorded, across routes that left no diary and no captain's log. The Kilwa coins may have travelled from the Sultanate's mint to an East African trader, to a Gujarati merchant, to a Macassan fisherman, to an Australian shore in a chain of transactions, so ordinary to the people involved that not one of them thought to write it down. Or they may have arrived through some entirely different sequence that scholars have not yet imagined. Small objects have always had this power, the power to reopen questions that larger, more legible sources had appeared to settle. A ceramic shard from a Chinese kiln found in a medieval Swahili kitchen tells us something that no account book preserves. A fragment of Indian cotton cloth recovered from the soil of a coastal warehouse speaks to a relationship between cultures that the formal historical record mentions only in passing, and 5 copper coins from a sultanate on the Indian Ocean's western shore found on a beach at the other end of that ocean's reach speak to something larger still, to the extraordinary web of movement and exchange that connected the medieval world across waters that most people in that world never crossed and never imagined crossing. The Kilwa mint closed, eventually. The sultanate that issued those coins would face pressures that no currency could resolve. But for 5 centuries, in copper and silver and the occasional gleam of gold, it had proclaimed to anyone who would listen that here, on this particular bend of the East African coast, there existed a civilization serious enough, sophisticated enough, and sovereign enough to put its name on money. That claim crossed the ocean in ways its makers almost certainly never planned. Whether those coins reached Australia on the deck of a dhow, or in the hold of a Portuguese carrack, or through some stranger passage still, the distance they travelled is its own kind of answer to the question of how far the Indian Ocean world actually extended. The coins could not speak for themselves. They could tell you where they were minted, roughly when, and from what metal, but they could not tell you what the city that produced them looked like at midday, what language its merchants argued in at the waterfront, whether the Sultan's hall smelled of frankincense or fish salt or both. For that, historians have always turned to the people who came from outside and wrote down what they found. And on the Swahili coast, those outside witnesses left a record that is vivid, sometimes extraordinary, and riddled with problems that any careful reader learns to see almost immediately. The earliest substantial Arabic account of the East African coast comes from al-Masudi, a geographer and traveller from Baghdad who was writing in the early 10th century. Al-Masudi called the region the land of the Zanj and described it as warm, fertile, rich in gold and ivory, home to immense herds of elephants. He noted, with the precision of a man who understood commodity markets, that the local people used iron rather than gold and silver as their primary medium of value, a detail that cuts against any simple portrait of the coast as uniformly wealthy in precious metals. He also recorded that there was a Muslim island community in the region, centred on a mosque of notable size. These details hold up reasonably well when set against the archaeological record. Iron was indeed a major trade good. Islam had established a presence on the coast by the 10th century, and mosque foundations at Kilwa and elsewhere confirm it. But al-Masudi was also writing for an audience far away, readers in Baghdad and Cairo and Basra, who wanted not just information but entertainment, confirmation of the world's strangeness. And so his account of the Zanj coast includes claims about cannibal peoples living in the interior, claims that are impossible to verify, almost certainly distorted, and entirely consistent with the literary conventions of medieval Arabic geography, which organised distant peoples along a moral spectrum from the admirably pious to the conveniently savage. Al-Masudi was, by any measure, one of the more careful geographers of his age. The cannibal passage is a reminder that even careful observers wrote within frameworks that shaped what they chose to record and how. Ibn Battuta is a different kind of witness. When he arrived at Kilwa in 1331, he was not a geographer compiling information at a desk. He was a traveller who had actually been there, who had disembarked and walked the streets and sat in the Sultan's presence and eaten food prepared in the city's kitchens. His testimony carries the authority of direct experience and the limitations that come with it. He described Kilwa as a large town built largely of wood, its people jet black, some bearing facial tattoos, its sultan a man who set aside a fifth of the booty from coastal raids to distribute as charity. A practice Ibn Battuta, himself a deeply religious man shaped by Moroccan Maliki tradition, recognised and approved. He praised the wooden mosques, the generosity of the faithful, the flow of gold dust arriving from Sofala. He was seeing, in other words, a genuinely prosperous and genuinely Islamic city, and his account reflects that reality. It also reflects his preoccupations. Ibn Battuta was a Muslim scholar travelling in a Muslim world, and what interested him most was the quality of Islamic practice he encountered, the orthodoxy of the Sultan's conduct, the grandeur of the religious infrastructure, the generosity appropriate to a ruler of the faithful, the commercial mechanics of how the gold actually moved from the interior to the harbour to the ships, the labour arrangements, the role of non-Muslim African peoples in the trade networks that fed Kilwa's wealth. These things appear in his account only at the margins, or not at all. His Kilwa is an Islamic city. That is not false, but it is incomplete. This is where the stones become as important as the sentences. The ruins of Kilwa Kisiwani are not silent partners to the written record. They are active interlocutors, and sometimes they push back. When Ibn Battuta describes a city built of wood, and when the site then yields the remains of an 11th century great mosque built in coral stone, a palace complex of considerable scale, and a material inventory that includes Chinese porcelain, Persian earthenware and Arabian glazed ceramics, the two pictures must be reconciled. The wooden structures Ibn Battuta saw have not survived. Wood rots in the coastal climate, and what archaeology recovers is mostly what was built to last. But the imported goods, the coin hoards, the architectural ambition of the stone buildings that do survive, all of this confirms the wealth that the Arab accounts describe, while adding dimensions that the literary record passes over in silence. A shard of Song dynasty porcelain embedded in a Kilwa floor layer is not making a rhetorical point. It is simply there, evidence of a transaction that happened, a preference that existed, a connection that was real enough to survive in ceramic form for 8 centuries. The accumulated testimony of Arabic writers, al-Masudi, Ibn Battuta, and others, including the anonymous compiler of the Kilwa Chronicle, creates a picture that is genuinely valuable and genuinely partial in equal measure. These writers document the coast's reputation for wealth within the broader Indian Ocean world. They confirm the presence and vitality of Islamic practice. They give texture to political structures, to the role of the sultan, to the expectations of piety and generosity that governed rulership in the Swahili city-states. And they establish, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the ports of the East African coast were known, visited and respected by the most sophisticated commercial and intellectual networks of the medieval world. A city that attracts the attention of Ibn Battuta, a man who had also been to Constantinople, Delhi and Mali, is not a footnote. But these accounts are limited to the waterfront and the Sultan's Hall. They do not take us into the neighbourhoods where Swahili craftspeople worked, or into the arrangements between coastal elites and the African societies of the interior, who controlled the first stages of the gold and ivory trade. The women of Kilwa, who archaeology suggests played significant roles in weaving the social fabric of the community, are almost entirely absent from the Arabic literary record. The complex layered identity of Swahili people themselves, neither straightforwardly African nor Arab nor Persian, but something distinct that had been forming across generations of exchange and intermarriage, tends to flatten in outside accounts into one of a few available categories: the pious Muslim, the exotic black stranger, the wealthy merchant, the dangerous unknown. This is the fundamental challenge that historians of the Swahili coast face when they open these texts. The outsiders who wrote about the coast were genuinely observant, sometimes brilliant, and always operating within cultural and literary conventions that pulled their accounts towards certain conclusions before their ships even arrived in harbour. Al-Masudi's fertile land of iron and ivory, Ibn Battuta's generous sultan and well-built mosques, these are not inventions, but they are portraits, and portraits always tell you something about the painter as well as the subject. The honest answer is that no single source, Arabic chronicle, Portuguese report, oral tradition, or archaeological layer, gives us the Swahili coast whole. Each one illuminates a different corner of a very large room, and the shadows between the light sources are real shadows, not simply gaps waiting to be filled. What the best scholarship does is hold multiple sources in conversation simultaneously, letting the coins check the chronicles and the ceramics complicate the geographers, reading the ruins against the texts and the texts against the ruins, and maintaining enough intellectual humility to acknowledge what the record, for all its richness, still cannot tell us. The people who built Kilwa were not waiting to be described. They were busy. The dhows were loading, the gold was moving, the monsoon was turning. Their world was too intricate and too alive to fit neatly into anyone else's categories. And that fact, as frustrating as it sometimes is for historians, is also, in its own way, a form of evidence. And then the dhows stopped loading. Not everywhere, not all at once, but the pattern of exchange that had sustained the Swahili coast for 1,000 years began, in the space of a few extraordinary years, to come apart. The instrument of that disruption arrived from the Atlantic armed with cannon and a sense of divine mission, and it did not come to trade on equal terms. When Vasco da Gama's fleet reached the East African coast in April 1498, it was entering a world that had been functioning as an integrated commercial system for centuries. The pilots knew these waters, the merchants understood the monsoon schedules, the harbour masters of Kilwa and Mombasa and Malindi had been managing the flow of gold, ivory, cloth and porcelain since before Europe had a name for the ocean they were sailing on. Da Gama was not discovering an empty sea. He was intruding into a mature, intricate commercial civilization, and from the moment his ships appeared on the horizon, the Swahili city-states faced a kind of power they had no existing framework for managing. Mombasa recognized the threat almost immediately. When Da Gama's vessels anchored off its harbour, the city refused cooperation, refused pilots, refused the warm diplomatic fiction that these armoured strangers might simply be unusual merchants. The rival port of Malindi made a different calculation, choosing engagement over confrontation, providing Da Gama with the experienced Indian pilot he needed to cross to Calicut. That divergence, Mombasa hostile, Malindi accommodating, was itself a symptom of how quickly the Portuguese presence began distorting the political relationships between cities that had, for generations, competed fiercely but within a shared set of commercial rules. Now the rules were changing faster than any sultan could adapt. Da Gama returned. In 1502, on his second major expedition, he did not bother with the diplomatic courtesies of his first visit. He arrived at Kilwa and presented the Sultan, Ibrahim ibn Sulayman, with a demand: tribute, paid annually to the Portuguese crown. The Sultan, facing carracks whose broadsides could reduce his coral stone buildings to rubble in a morning, agreed. It was not a negotiation. It was the first instalment of what would become a systematic fiscal extraction, a transfer of wealth flowing not along the monsoon routes to Arabia and India, but westward, toward Lisbon. The city that had minted its own coins for 4 centuries and set the terms of the gold trade from Sofala to Hormuz now owed tribute to a king it had never heard of 3 years earlier. But it was the summer of 1505 that delivered the decisive blow. Francisco de Almeida sailed from Lisbon in March of that year, commanding what was, by any measure, an overwhelming military force, 21 ships, including 11 heavy carracks, and approximately 1,500 armed men. This was not a trading fleet with guards. It was a conquest armada, sent to transform the Indian Ocean from an open commercial highway into a Portuguese-controlled corridor, and the Swahili coast was its first major target. Almeida arrived at Kilwa on the 24th of July. The city that Ibn Battuta had admired for its generosity and Islamic piety, the city that had funded the great mosque with gold from Zimbabwe and maintained the most sophisticated mint on the East African coast, fell in a single morning. 500 Portuguese soldiers went ashore. The emir fled. Almeida imposed a new ruler, a figure acceptable to Portuguese interests, installed a garrison of 550 men, and began construction of Fort Santiago, a stone fortification that would anchor Portuguese control over the harbour. The coral stone walls that Kilwa's builders had raised over generations of prosperous trade now functioned as the backdrop for a foreign flag. The treasury that had once paid for porcelain from the Song dynasty workshops now paid tribute to the crown of Portugal. 3 weeks later, on the 13th of August, the fleet appeared before Mombasa. This was not the city's first encounter with Portuguese ships, and Mombasa had not forgotten 1498. The exchange of cannon fire was brief but devastating. The Portuguese guns far outranged anything the harbour's defenders could bring to bear, and when Almeida's forces demanded vassalage and tribute, the city refused. What followed was brutal: a direct assault, the capture of inhabitants, and the systematic demonstration that defiance carried a cost in blood and fire that no Dhow-born merchant fleet had ever imposed in all the centuries of Swahili commercial history. The Indian Ocean had known pirates, known rivalries, known the occasional violent seizure of a cargo. It had not known this: organised, state-sponsored military violence designed not to steal a shipment, but to restructure an entire commercial world according to someone else's priorities. At Sofala, on the 4th of September, Pero de Anaya's squadron of 6 ships established a permanent Portuguese factory and fort on the very inlet through which the gold of Great Zimbabwe had flowed northward to Kilwa for centuries. The geometry of the trade route, the arrangement that had made Kilwa wealthy and Sofala indispensable, was being seized and rerouted. Where Swahili merchants had once been the essential intermediaries, standing between the gold-producing interior and the wider Indian Ocean market, Portuguese garrisons now inserted themselves at the choke points, demanding their percentage and offering in return only the continued permission to exist. The political manipulation that accompanied the military violence was, in some ways, equally destructive. At Sofala, Portuguese agents had already worked to cultivate an elderly and partially blind local ruler named Isuf, persuading him to sign a treaty in 1502 and later to accept a Portuguese-backed successor. The technique was familiar from European dynastic politics. Find a claimant, attach him to your interest, delegitimize his rivals. But its application on the Swahili coast tore through governance structures that had maintained a degree of stability precisely because they operated outside the framework of European-style territorial sovereignty. Swahili city-states had competed intensely with one another, but they had shared a commercial logic that made cooperation possible. Portuguese intervention converted those competitions into proxy conflicts, with European support available to whichever local faction proved most useful and most pliant. What makes this rupture historically significant, beyond the violence itself which was real and should not be softened, is what it ended. The Swahili coast had spent 1,000 years building something genuinely remarkable, a maritime civilization that was neither purely African nor purely Asian, but a synthesis of both, a culture that had absorbed Persian settlers and Arabian trade goods, and Indian textiles, and Chinese porcelain, and made from all of it something entirely its own. Its merchants had navigated the Indian Ocean, not as strangers borrowing someone else's routes, but as masters of a system they had helped to shape. The monsoon worked for them because they understood it. The trade networks extended because they maintained them. The Portuguese arrived as intruders into this maturity, not as discoverers of a void. The sea they claimed to have opened had been open for centuries. The routes they sought to control had been controlled, with remarkable sophistication, by the same Dhow captains and harbour administrators whose records and buildings and coins now sat in the background, while Almeida raised Fort Santiago's walls over the ruins of Kilwa's autonomy. In the space of 7 years, from da Gama's first arrival to the establishment of the Sofala fort, a commercial system that had taken a millennium to construct was forced into subordination to a power that barely understood what it was dismantling. The Dhows did not disappear, the monsoon did not change. But the world through which they moved had been altered in ways that no single season's sailing could repair, and the Swahili city-states would spend the following centuries trying to find their footing in an ocean that no longer operated by the rules they had built. The collapse was not clean. Empires rarely die in a single moment, and the Swahili city-states, for all the shock of 1505, did not simply vanish beneath the shadow of Portuguese forts. What followed was something slower, and in its way, more complicated. A long reorganization of power, a gradual migration of trade toward new centers, and the stubborn survival of a culture that had been shaped by centuries of exchange and refused to be entirely remade by conquest. The Portuguese held their garrisons, but holding a fort and controlling a coastline are different things. The stone walls of Fort Santiago loomed over Kilwa's harbour, but the Portuguese were never numerous enough to replace the commercial infrastructure they had disrupted. They could tax the trade, they could not replicate the networks that generated it. Those networks, built on personal relationships, shared languages, mutual credit, and the accumulated trust of generations of merchants, began quietly routing around the new gatekeepers. Swahili traders adapted, as coastal peoples always do, finding the currents that the foreign cannon could not block. Northward, the axis of coastal power shifted. From the late 16th century onward, Omani Arabs had been extending their own maritime reach into the western Indian Ocean, and they recognized in the weakened Swahili ports an opportunity that the Portuguese had inadvertently created. By the 1690s, Omani fleets were challenging Portuguese positions directly, and in 1698 they took Fort Jesus in Mombasa, after a siege that lasted nearly 3 years. It was a transfer of dominance rather than a liberation, but it mattered enormously for where the coast's commercial energy would concentrate. Zanzibar, under Omani patronage, emerged as the new organizing centre. Gold and ivory and increasingly and devastatingly enslaved human beings flowed through its harbour under different political management, but along routes whose geography the medieval Swahili sailors had established. The ocean's logic endured even as its masters changed. For the old city-states themselves, the centuries after Portuguese intervention, were years of diminishment and internal fracture. Kilwa never fully recovered its earlier scale or confidence. Sofala, once the keystone of the gold road from Great Zimbabwe, shrank as the gold trade itself diminished, and the interior kingdoms it had depended upon went through their own transformations. The elaborate commercial hierarchy that had made Kilwa the wealthiest port on the East African coast, its authority radiating outward through a network of smaller towns and dhow captains and inland trading partners, gradually dissolved into a collection of places that remembered greatness without quite being able to reconstruct it. And yet something essential did not dissolve. Language is the most resilient of inheritances, and the Swahili language, Kiswahili as it is properly known, its very name derived from the Arabic word for coast, survived everything the following centuries could deliver. It had already absorbed Persian loanwords and Arabic grammar and the vocabularies of a dozen trading partners before the Portuguese arrived. It continued absorbing, continued adapting, continued spreading inland along the same trade routes that had carried cloth and porcelain and copper coins across the continent's interior. By the time European colonial powers were drawing their own arbitrary lines across East Africa in the 19th century, Kiswahili was not simply a coastal tongue, but a lingua franca spoken from the Great Lakes to the shores of the Indian Ocean, carrying within its syllables the memory of a maritime civilization that had flourished for 1,000 years. Today it is the official language of Tanzania and Kenya, a co-official language of the East African community, and spoken in various forms by somewhere between 150 and 200 million people, a number that would have been recognizable as power to the merchants of medieval Kilwa, even if the form it takes now is entirely different. The mosques endured too. The Friday prayers that had structured urban life in the Swahili city-states, the madrasas that had trained scholars in Arabic alongside commerce, the Islamic legal traditions that had governed contracts and inheritance, and the terms of trade. These institutions proved more durable than the political structures that had housed them. Swahili Islamic identity was never simply imported from Arabia or Persia. It had been localized, indigenized, woven into the rhythms of coastal life over centuries, and that deep integration made it resilient in ways that a foreign-imposed regime could not anticipate or easily undo. The muezzin's call continued to sound over towns where Portuguese forts had crumbled, over harbours where Omani sultans had replaced Shirazi lineages, over streets where 19th-century German and British colonial administrators drew up their administrative maps without quite understanding the civilization whose bones lay beneath their survey lines. The bones, of course, were literal as well as metaphorical. The ruins of Kilwa Kisiwani, the great mosque with its vaulted ceiling, the Husuni Kubwa Palace complex, the coral stone walls that had once enclosed a city of genuine magnificence, survived the centuries in a state of slow, dignified deterioration. In 1981, UNESCO inscribed both Kilwa Kisiwani and the nearby ruins of Songo Menara on the World Heritage List, formally recognizing what historians and archaeologists had been arguing for decades, that these were not peripheral curiosities but central monuments of global maritime history. The inscription brought attention, and eventually resources. Conservation work proceeded through subsequent decades, painstaking and often underfunded but persistent. In 2014, the sites were removed from UNESCO's list of World Heritage in Danger, a quiet, bureaucratic milestone that represented something larger, an acknowledgement that the medieval Swahili world was worth protecting, worth understanding, worth presenting to the world not as an African footnote to Asian or European histories but as a civilization in its own right. Modern archaeology has made that argument with increasing precision and confidence. The ancient DNA studies published in the early 21st century, tracing the admixture of Persian and African ancestry in medieval Swahili burial sites, gave scientific texture to legends that had always carried historical weight. The Kilwa coins found on Australia's Wessel Islands, small copper discs stamped with the authority of sultans who ruled a port on the Tanzanian coast, raised questions about the reach of pre-European Indian Ocean navigation that researchers are still working to answer. Each excavation, each genetic sample, each coin recovered from unexpected soil adds another layer to a story that was never as obscure as colonial-era historiography preferred to believe. For modern East Africans, this history is not merely archaeological. The Swahili coast's medieval merchants were not distant ancestors, operating in some separate, sealed-off past. They were the originators of patterns, linguistic, commercial, religious, architectural, that flow directly into the present. The coastal towns of Kenya and Tanzania carry their medieval heritage in their street plans, their mosques, their markets, their linguistic textures. When a scholar in Dar es Salaam writes a paper in Kiswahili, when a dhow captain on the Zanzibar Channel reads The Morning Wind, when a heritage tourist walks the worn stone corridors of Husuni Kubwa and tries to imagine the palace at its height, all of them are in contact, however indirectly, with the civilization that the Swahili sailors built across 1,000 years of monsoon-driven exchange. The age of the sultanates ended, but what it built, the language, the faith, the urban memory, the idea that the African coast was not an edge but a centre, that did not end. It transformed, absorbed new pressures, found new forms, and persisted. Which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about any great civilization. Not that it lasted forever, but that it left enough of itself behind to matter, centuries later, to people who are still learning what it was. There is a particular kind of historical satisfaction that comes not from resolution but from recognition. The moment when a story long told in fragments suddenly reveals the shape it always had. The Swahili coast offers that moment, and it offers it repeatedly to anyone willing to look closely enough at the evidence that keeps surfacing. In laboratory results, in remote island soil, in the careful reconstruction of trade winds and timber joints and minted copper. What sustained Swahili influence for the better part of a millennium was not a single advantage but a convergence of them, each reinforcing the others in ways that made the whole system remarkably difficult to dislodge. The monsoon gave these merchants their calendar, a dependable, seasonally reversing engine that transformed the Indian Ocean from a barrier into a circuit. The southwest winds of summer carried dhows northeast toward India and Arabia. The northeast winds of winter brought them home. Swahili sailors did not merely exploit this pattern. They understood it with the precision of people who had spent generations reading the sky, and they built ships engineered specifically to move within it. The metepi and the dhow, sewn together from coconut palm timber rather than nailed, with listine rigs that could be adjusted to catch winds from multiple angles, were not primitive vessels compensating for a lack of technology. They were highly sophisticated solutions to specific navigational problems, capable of beating to windward, of navigating shallow coastal approaches that larger foreign ships could not enter, of carrying 40 to 60 crew and tens of tons of cargo on voyages that crossed the width of an ocean and returned within a single trading year. Layer on top of that technical foundation a commercial strategy built on relationships rather than coercion, the accumulated trust of generations of merchants who shared languages, credit systems, and legal frameworks, and you begin to understand why Kilwa's influence radiated so far and held for so long. The city did not simply export gold and ivory. It exported a model of exchange, a way of organizing the movement of goods across enormous distances, through networks of mutual obligation that were far more resilient than any single political authority. When Kilwa minted its own copper, silver and gold coins beginning in the 11th century, those coins were not merely currency. They were statements of sovereignty, declarations that this African city-state operated on its own terms within a global economy. And the coins travelled accordingly, turning up in contexts that still challenge easy explanation. 5 of them, dated to the 12th century, were found on Australia's remote Wessel Islands, thousands of kilometres from the nearest Swahili port. How they arrived there remains genuinely contested. Portuguese shipwreck, Chinese intermediary, Swahili pilot aboard a Far Eastern vessel, the hypotheses multiply, and none has yet achieved consensus. What is not contested is the implication that objects minted on the East African coast made their way to a shore that European navigators would not reach for another 3 centuries. The mystery of those coins is itself a kind of argument, evidence that the horizons of medieval Indian Ocean commerce extended further than older histories have been comfortable acknowledging. The DNA evidence makes a different kind of argument, equally powerful in its own register. The ancient genomic data recovered from more than 80 medieval Swahili burial sites revealed a rapid admixture event approximately 1,000 years ago, in which Persian male ancestry combined with African female lineages in proportions that are striking and specific. Roughly 80% of the male ancestry in these medieval genomes traces to Persian origins. The social and kinship structures, embedded in matrilineal inheritance patterns, trace to African ones. The Shirazi origin legends that had been treated for generations as romantic founding mythology turned out to encode something real, and later genetic layers, Arabian ancestry introduced after the Omani takeover, are visible too, written into the biology of people who are alive today, linking modern Swahili identity to every political shift that shaped the coast across 10 centuries. This is history that cannot be argued away. It exists in the cells of living people, as well as in the bones of the long dead, and it insists on a version of the past that centers African maritime agency rather than treating it as peripheral. That insistence is perhaps why this history matters most urgently right now. For much of the modern era, the intellectual frameworks through which world history was organized had a way of making African civilizations disappear into the backgrounds of other stories, as sources of raw materials, as recipients of outside influence, as spaces waiting to be connected to a global economy that supposedly began elsewhere. The Swahili coast refuses that erasure with considerable force. These were African cities, built by African and African-descended peoples, conducting African foreign policy, minting African currency, and participating as full and sophisticated partners in what was, for its time, the most extensive trading network on Earth. They were not on the margins of medieval globalization. They were among its architects. The chronologies are still disputed in places. The origin legends carry ambiguities that archaeology has not yet fully resolved. The coins in Australia still await a definitive explanation. These open questions are not weaknesses in the story. They are what make it alive, what draw researchers back to the excavation sites and the genetic databases and the linguistic archives. Every unanswered question is an invitation, and the Swahili coast has been issuing those invitations for decades to historians willing to take them seriously. What they find, every time, is a civilization of genuine and global significance. Sailors who read the monsoon as fluently as a written language, merchants who built commercial webs spanning 3 continents, city builders who raised coral stone palaces on an African island and filled them with Chinese porcelain and Persian poetry. People whose descendants speak their language across 200 million mouths today, and whose genetic signatures persist in living bodies along the same coastline where medieval Dhows once waited for the wind to change. The wind always changed. It always brought them home. And the story of those voyages, recovered piece by piece from the soil and the genome and the archive, is only now being told in full.